Hai sahabat Pioneer, jumpa kembali. Di negara-negara maju di dunia, saat ini di bidang ekonomi dan teknologi internet sedang hangat-hangatnya membicarakan atau membahas Web 3, blockchain, kontrak pintar serta Web 3 yang mensupport terhadap cryptocurrency. Karena perkembangan dari dunia digital tidak bisa dihindari lagi. Mereka telah mengundang para pakar ahli pelaku bisnis untuk berdiskusi bersama. Hal ini juga dilakukan untuk mengantisipasi pencegahan efek dampak yang ditimbulkan ke depan. Dan tentu melihat manfaat-manfaat ke depan yang diberikan oleh teknologi internet seperti Web 3 yang support terkait dengan blockchain dan kripto. Serta melihat manfaat efisiensi yang diberikan dan tentu tidak merusak lingkungan dan hemat energi. Mereka mengundang para pakar ahli juga pelaku bisnis lainnya untuk berdiskusi.
Was that suddenly you could not only read content, but you could also write content. This is when the blogosphere became a big thing. People remember this from the late 90s, the early 2000s. The reason for the centralization of the internet, of course, was that all of that activity was being monetized by a very small number of companies. Facebook, as the chairwoman mentions, Google, and 2 or 3 other companies. What makes Web3 different is the ability to own the actual network. And that's what crypto assets themselves represent, is an ownership stake in an underlying network. So when you hear people talk about, for example, layer 1 tokens, what they mean is this is your reward for providing the ledger maintenance services, the computing power to the network that on Web 1 and 2 was done by Google, right? So now people in my hometown of Pueblo, Colorado can actually own the Ethereum network, but they can't own the internet. That's owned by Google and a few other companies. That's what the project of crypto is all about, is allowing people to directly own the networks that have native assets that are supporting it, and that's the nature of decentralization, where the token holders are the people who control the asset, not Google.
Token holders, for our language here on the Hill, those are digital assets, right? Which are the keys to open up the ledger for you to participate, right? So describe to us how those digital assets fit into this internet revolution, Web 3.
So the concept is that you have sort of application layer tokens and you have protocol layer tokens. So if I'm an owner of Bitcoin, let's say that I'm a miner of Bitcoin, somebody who actually creates Bitcoin. The Bitcoin is the reward I receive for doing the work to keep the network operational, and that allows me to own a piece of the Bitcoin blockchain. Or take Ethereum, which is easier to understand. The Ether token represents an ownership stake in the network, but on top of that network are all kinds of apps that get built on the network, much like the apps on your phone depend on the underlying network existing that lets the phone operate. And so people will make judgments about which network is likely to win, and they will invest in the tokens in that network much the same way you might invest in Google stock because you think Google is going to scale access to the original internet. The difference being here, you can vote on what happens in the future of a proof of stake network, for example. You can get rewarded through a proof of work token for maintaining a ledger on something like Bitcoin. But the real message here is that what happens on the decentralized internet is decided by the investors, versus what happens on the main internet is decided by Twitter, Facebook, Google, and a small number of other companies.
Okay, so getting this layer on digital assets right, for Congress to understand this, everything is built upon that on-ramp to this new internet. So very important for us to be sensitive to how this develops and any actions we take in terms of laws and updating laws to incorporate these new technologies.
Yeah, Mr. McHenry couldn't agree more, and I think when you hear about all of the problems of different big tech companies, the importance of an owner-controlled network becomes clear.
Okay, owner-controlled network rather than a cooperative, right? And
Yes.
thinking in those terms.
Absolutely.
Right? So if you're not a part of management, you're not making a decision in Web 2. If you are a participant in the network, you're cooperating in the making of those decisions.
Exactly right.
Okay. So I ask this not to be insulting to the panel, but to have a level set here so we have an understanding of what we're talking about. This is not simply about you on this panel. It is about trillions of dollars of assets that did not exist before Satoshi wrote his white paper 13 years ago. It's about $3 trillion in notional value at this stage around the development of a whole new range, a whole new suite of technology that will be developed across the globe, whether or not the United States embraces it and
these digitally native assets. Some of them can be tokenized dollars. I mean, the SWIFT network is still very slow. The traditional banking system, are we all going to use that? Should we have these centralized systems run by corporations or governments? Is that just what we're going to use in the future? Or are we going to have a new system, and that system will have its own native token to reward good actors in the validation? Now, there's a spectrum of activities that's going to take place on these networks, and some of them, a lot of them are going to be scammy, junky, garbagey, and it's very difficult for retail investors to separate the good from the bad. I don't disagree with any of that. If you do believe that we are, as a society, moving towards having this more global settlement system that underpins all the activity of the internet, then crypto could be that thing that is emerging.
Would you agree that it has not yet closed the door? Or it hasn't made the case for that yet with enough of the population?
I mean, I think the mass population certainly hasn't bought in, but I think these networks have shown themselves to be resilient. I think it's easy for us. We live in a very comfortable society. We have access to very good banking. And so there's not a lot of reason for us to hold these assets, maybe yet, or transact in these assets. But the fact that you could use some type of tokenized US dollar and move it across something like Ethereum for a few pennies, you know, in 10 seconds, that's a big deal. And you're starting to see some businesses like Visa say, maybe we should test out, do we use this as a form of settlement? Doesn't mean that it's going to be Ethereum, doesn't mean it's going to be built on Bitcoin, but that's the promise of these networks. And I think that you're seeing a lot of really smart people, computer engineering students, rally around. There's a lot of tech here. It's still very early days, but there's a lot of potential in these systems.
Brian sounds, Molly, like he sees some potential here. How about you?
I mean, I won't argue with the idea that there's potential in digital currency and in, you know, digital transaction layers. That I think is hard to argue with. But the idea that cryptocurrency will form that layer, I think, is pretty unlikely. It does not function very well as a currency. It is not being used for the sort of use cases that were just described. And a lot of the efficiencies of it that have been touched upon that involve, you know, cheap transaction fees, speed of settlement, things like that, are only possible because of the lack of regulation that's being applied. You know, the time it takes for a transaction to settle, you know, if you're sending it cross-border, or the fees that are applied there, those are not being applied because we don't have the technological capability to send a transaction quickly digitally or to do it cheaply. They're being applied because there's a lot of red tape there, typically, that is being used to crack down on things like money laundering. And so when you get rid of the restrictions on money laundering or various other crimes that are committed through the financial system, well, then, yeah, it's cheap and it's fast, but you also end up with a system that is full of scams and frauds like the ones we've just seen.
Well, part of the promise of it, Brian, I thought, was the notion that it would promote global financial inclusion and it would kind of offer banking to the unbanked, if I can put it that way. Do you see it yet fulfilling that promise?
Not at all. I think that that's certainly a hope that a lot of people have, and I hope people don't give up on that, because that's something, again, that's very important. You know, in Canada, in the US, we have access to banking. There's billions of people on the planet who don't have access to identity, to a digital representation of a dollar. But if you think about people who live in Argentina or Turkey, you know, where their currencies essentially have completely devalued their life savings, we may consider Bitcoin way too volatile for us to hold a significant amount of our wealth in. But if you live in some of those other countries, if they could hold a tokenized US dollar, that's great. But that also then triggers the question of, do people have the right to opt out of a monetary system in their specific jurisdiction? And there's pros and cons to that.
Lee, how about you on that question, on the issue of whether this at least held out some promise of global financial inclusion that the rest of the system did not offer?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the more pernicious arguments made by the crypto industry. And you've seen this argument made with similar so-called financial innovations. I mean, I would just go back to the financial crisis of 2008 and the various, you know, subprime lending products that were pushed on the market. I mean, these were billed as a way for low-income and minority folks to, you know, get access to the American dream, you know, which is a house. And unfortunately, you know, many of these individuals were taken advantage of, you know, right before the bubble burst. And that's exactly what's happening now. And it always happens, you know, with any financial bubble, is that the people who can least afford it are the last to get in before it bursts and hold the bag. And so really with crypto, what you're seeing is predatory inclusion where, minority groups are specifically being targeted, with crypto products and told that this is an opportunity to get rich quick. So, it's really troubling because the facts on the ground are that crypto is actually not promoting financial inclusion. And in terms of, adoption in other countries, to Brian's point, just look at the situation in El Salvador when they embraced Bitcoin as legal tender. And it's been an absolute economic and, frankly, a humanitarian disaster. I mean, the credit rating agencies have downgraded their sovereign credit rating. The IMF is threatening to cut off funding. No one is using Bitcoin there to actually buy anything. No one is using Bitcoin there to actually buy anything because it's way too volatile and it's too complicated. So the only one who seems to have benefited is the corrupt president there and his cronies. So there's no evidence that it promotes financial inclusion, and there's plenty of evidence that other financial innovations do promote financial inclusion. You look at M-Pesa in Kenya and Africa, for instance, right? That's real-time payments. You look at China, they have QR code-based payments, WeChat Pay, Alipay, that are, billions of users, and China completely bypassed, having any type of traditional banking infrastructure. So, the crypto community likes to point out what are very real problems with our legacy financial institutions. I'm not denying that, but they're not offering the solutions, and there are better solutions out there.
Are you as down on it for the same reasons as they are?
I definitely, anytime somebody says, I have some new thing that's going to help promote financial inclusion and help the poor and the downtrodden, and coincidentally, it's also going to make me personally a lot of money, you need predatory actors on, on low-income people, on marginalized people through crypto. I also do, one thing that I do find very interesting is stablecoin adoption in emerging economies. So stablecoins are those, crypto assets that are backed by usually the dollar. And you're seeing that adoption is really going up in a lot of emerging economies, and people are using them to, send money abroad. You can use it to shop online, lots of things that you can do, if you don't have access to a bank account. So I think that's really interesting that it's sort of like one side of the promise of crypto minus the, censorship resistant, no government involved side. It's very interesting.
Sementara ini mari kita bahas tentang Web Pi Network. Informasi pertama yaitu mengenai Pi node dan distribusi dari Pi Network di dunia, di mana negara Korea mendominasi sebagai negara terbanyak menggunakan menjalankan jaringan node dari Pi Network yang disusul oleh negara Cina. Dan kemudian tempat ketiga adalah Vietnam, kemudian negara Jepang di posisi keempat, dan kelima adalah negara Amerika. Negara Indonesia tidak termasuk di dalam 20 peringkat pengguna node jaringan Pi Network. Di kesempatan kali ini kita akan bahas mengenai domain pi.com. Minipi.com telah terdaftar pada tahun 2018.
Majored in distributed applications for blockchain at Stanford University and has experience teaching blockchain-related classes at the university. He's a former CTO of StartX, a startup accelerator program based on the Stanford University campus, which is sponsored by leading global companies such as Amazon.
Yang nama domain berakhiran dengan pi.com ternyata telah banyak teregistrasi oleh perusahaan di dunia. Mari kita simak video dengan seksama seperti apa yang kita dapat ketahui dari website whois.com. Yaitu whois adalah website jika diterjemahkan yang berarti siapa pemiliknya. Whois sudah teregistrasi atau ada sejak tahun 1995 atau sekitar 28 tahun yang lalu. Di tahun tersebut pengguna internet belum begitu sepopuler sekarang dan masih menggunakan web 1. Whois telah mendapat akreditasi oleh Internet Corporation for Assigned and Number. Dari sini kita akan dapat mengetahui banyak informasi penting atau hal-hal tentang kepemilikan dan informasi lainnya dari sebuah domain website. Kapan sebuah domain diregistrasi? Siapa yang mendaftarkannya? Dan dapat diketahui pula apa name servernya, termasuk alamat pendaftar, nama yang mendaftarkannya, nomor top pendaftarnya, dan lain-lainnya. Di sini beberapa domain yang berakhiran dengan menggunakan pi.com ternyata telah banyak didaftarkan oleh perusahaan-perusahaan besar di dunia. Ini menjadi sebuah tanda tanya. Jika kita cermati, telah banyak yang menggunakannya di register perusahaan-perusahaan. Dengan penemuan di situs UIS ini akan banyak pertanyaan-pertanyaan. Mengapa mereka berlomba-lomba mendaftarkan domain website dengan kata atau nama yang berakhiran dengan menggunakan pi.com? Hal yang sangat menarik untuk diulas bukan? Mengapa banyak sekali perusahaan besar mendaftarkan namanya berakhiran dengan kata pi.com? Misalkan seperti amazon.pi.com, walmart.pi.com, buy.pi.com, pigoglo.com, alibaba.pi.com, paypal.pi.com, Huawei.pi, Samsung.pi, Siemens.pi, Sony.pi, Toshiba.pi, National.pi, Oppo.pi, Xiaomi.pi, Vivo.pi, Tesla.pi, NASA.pi, Dubai.pi, Wall Street.pi, UNILEVER.pi, Timi.pi, Yamaha.pi, Suzuki.pi, Toyota.pi, Ford.pi, Honda.pi, Rolls-Royce.pi.com, Australian.pi, Philippi.com, Rolex.pi, Renault.pi, Land Rover.pi.com, Ferrari.pi, Mupi.com, dan masih banyak sekali yang belum kita ketahui. Apakah ini suatu kebetulan? Silakan tulis opini Anda di kolom komentar. Apakah P-Network ini telah dirancang dipersiapkan jauh sebelumnya untuk sebuah revolusi transaksi internet? Silakan tulis opini komentar Anda di kolom komentar dan terima kasih telah menonton. Jangan lupa di like dan subscribe jika Anda menyukai info video ini.
Hands neatly folded, and the pang of attention. Pi is exactly 3! Very sorry that it had to come to that, but...
Oh, China, is there nothing that can't be made in you? Ah, my first sucker.
Oh, $1. It's a trick! It's a trick! It's a trick! I never needed these. I never needed these. I never needed these.
Oh, looky here. It's the old fishing line on a dollar bill prank. Dollar bill prank. Dollar bill prank. Man, even a backwoods, no account, inbred, lead paint eating, kerosene huffing, roadkill chomping. What was my point? My point? My point?
That is a practical joke, Luann.
This isn't right. No one's falling for my pranks. At least it wasn't a total waste. I found a quarter.
What a moron,